Massimo Pigliucci, it is very good to see you again.
Hey, nice seeing you. It's a
Well,
different background, you notice?
yeah, and I'm going to ask you about that in a second. This, of course, is the Sophia program, and I welcome our viewers. Massimo is currently in Rome.
That's right.
Massimo, I thought before we started, maybe you should say just a few minutes about what you're doing in Rome, why you're in Rome, uh, and uh, and what's
And
been
then we'll
happening.
get down and dirty.
Yeah,
Yes.
yeah.
Yeah. So I'm in the middle of my sabbatical at this point, and I figured that 4 months of that I will spend in Rome. The sabbatical, the main project of the sabbatical is to write this book aimed at a sort of a general audience on ancient and modern Stoicism. And the book is particularly, and we talked about Stoicism a couple of times before. The conceit of the book basically is that it's an ongoing indirect conversation between me and Epictetus, one of the major Greek Roman Stoics. And so I figured, well, I can write anywhere in the world. I'm writing about Roman Stoicism. I might as well be in Rome, which has, of course, the added advantage of seeing my family, which is nice on a more regular basis. But and it's nice because I actually was able to get an apartment literally 3 minutes from the Colosseum. So when
Oh
I
my God.
run out of inspiration, I just go down and have a walk in front of the Roman Forum, and then everything comes back together.
What's the time schedule for the book? When are you supposed to be done? When is it supposed to come out? I mean, obviously that may all change, but what's the
Sure.
plan schedule?
Since it's not an academic book, it's going to be published in the United States by Basic Books, which is a publisher in New York. It's actually a fairly tight schedule. I'm supposed to be done with the first draft by the end of June, which is when I'm going to leave Rome.
Oh boy.
And then the final draft is supposed to be delivered to the publisher at the end of August. I think they're already scheduling publication, even though I've written only about a third of the book. But they're already scheduling publication for March or April of next year.
Okay, so
So
now,
amazing! It's just they're actually working on the cover right now. It's like
wow. That's not
seriously,
like academic publishing at all.
not at all. Not,
Because there's actual money at stake, right? I mean,
that's right.
so you have to say one thing about this remarkable wall behind you, and then we'll get
Yeah.
started.
Yeah, so we're broadcasting from my brother's home, and he's a collector of all sorts of stuff that is connected with comic books and superheroes and things like that. And so he has a wall, which is behind me, with all sorts of pictures of Marvel, DC, and other characters. And it's a very colorful wall, and probably our viewers can sort of eventually zoom in and see if they can recognize some of the characters behind me.
That's awesome. I have to say also, Massimo, that you're letting your hair grow out a little bit, and I have to say it looks really good.
Ah,
You don't like it?
we'll see. I'll check with my partner.
All right. So today, our subject today has grown out of an on and off argument you and I have been having across various boards on the in the interwebs, and about ethical eating. And I originally had been sort of harping on ethical veganism, but you wanted to expand the target to encompass ethical eating more generally, which
Right.
is more than fine for me. So we're going to talk about ethical eating, and we're also going to talk. It's going to lead us naturally to talk a little more broadly about the role that morals should play in our lives relative to other considerations. Why don't we, since you're the one who, since you have been doing this, why don't you talk a little bit about how you understand ethical eating and what sort of led you to start ethically eating, so to speak?
Yeah. So first of all, I should say what I mean by that. So
Yes.
ethical eating is a spectrum of positions, right? So at one extreme, I suppose there is veganism, or even more radically than that, probably those people that only eat, sort of roots and things like that. So in other words, things that are actually even damage a plant. So things, fruits that come out of the plant on their own. That's fairly extreme. I don't know many people that do that. The most common sort of extreme on one side of the distribution type of ethical eating is veganism, of course, which
Right.
means that
Right.
you eat products that have nothing to do with animals at all, either directly, like meat or fish, or indirectly, like eggs or cheese or things like that, right?
Right.
Then a little more mainstream is vegetarianism, of course, where you do eat things like cheese and eggs, especially if they're well sourced. In other words, you tend to eat things that are, eggs that are from free-ranging chickens, that sort of stuff. Then there is a number of other positions. You can be a little less sort of out there in a sense and be a pescatarian. So let's say you refuse to eat meat because of the way in which animals are usually treated, but you're okay with eating fish as long as it is, let's say, wild caught, as long as it is not a species that is risking extinction and things like that. Or you can do what I do at this point, a situation that I'm sort of settled after having explored actually a number of these. I've actually behaved as a vegetarian and as a pescatarian, never as a vegan. I just couldn't get all that far. But the situation that I have now, that I settled on now, is what I call sort of a generic ethical omnivory or ethically informed omnivory, meaning that in theory I eat anything, or close to it, let's say. I don't eat human beings. But other than
you have to tell us that.
Right. Yeah, exactly. So,
they do strange things in Italy, right? We need to.
So I eat pretty much anything, but I try to pay as much attention to where what I eat comes from and what sort of impact it has had from an ethical perspective. And that doesn't mean just the obvious, like, if I eat meat very rarely, but if I do, I'd rather be either animals that have been wild caught, for instance, or animals that have been really, really well treated and and sort of killed humanely and that sort of stuff. But it's in fact very rare that I eat meat. But it's not just that; it's also an environmental impact, right? So as I said before, if I eat fish, I pay attention to, well, is this a species that is going extinct? If so, I'd rather not. Like whales, for instance. When I was in Iceland, I did not eat whales, even though it's common fare over there. And I also tried as much as possible, because as you know, and I'm sure we're going to talk about this in a little bit, it's really complicated. Once you start paying attention to these things, the number of sources that you need to pay attention to and the number of variables it's very high. And also, it's not always quite clear who is right about what. There are very complex. It's not quite as simple as saying, "Oh, I'm a vegetarian, therefore there is no problem," because
right.
A vegetarian diet also incurs environmental impacts and so on and so forth. So, but I try to pay attention to also the sort of the human side of things.
Right.
So, for instance, is the food that I eat, come from sources where the labor itself, human labor, is well treated. Or, the obvious example is you go to a coffee house that does, not only organic coffee, but actually it's fair trade, things like that. If I can. I mean, I don't go all the way and sort of, unless it meets, unless what I eat or drink meets all of these criteria, I'm not going to do it, because otherwise my life will be really complicated and, very, very difficult. But other things consider, if I have a choice and I can make that choice, and even if it costs me a little more, or if it takes a little longer of a walk to get to the coffee place that meets my criteria better, then I do it.
Okay, so before we move on to the why, let me just focus a little more on the what. So something you said a little earlier on was that you played with pescatarianism, and did you say you also played with vegetarianism a little bit?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes.
So and the way you described why you didn't stick with that was sort of a I just couldn't go that far.
Right.
But does that mean that you wish you could? In other words, do you think that the vegan does represent a sort of ideal? It's just not one that you can. It's just not the one you can reach. The reason I ask this is because one of the arguments that we had started off with you saying that you admire vegans,
Right?
And I said I didn't,
Right.
And then we started having a whole argument about that. And I know you're not a vegan, and so I'd like to know, in a sense, how you think about the more extreme versions that you don't yourself practice.
I have an analogy, and if you don't mind, I'll go back to Stoicism as an analogy.
Sure.
And the reason for that is because if you remember when we talked about Stoicism, at some point we said that Epictetus, who is the guy that I'm writing a book about, right, who was a Stoic, actually has a chapter in his discourses where he says, ideally you would want to be a cynic, but if you can't be a cynic, at least be a Stoic. And of course, the cynics like Diogenes were those people that really were extreme in their philosophizing. They had no property. They went around essentially begging. They had a very, very simple life. And Epictetus and a number of other Stoics, but Epictetus in particular, thought that was the highest possible degree of commitment, basically, you could have.
Right.
But then he realized, not many people can do that, so at least be a Stoic. Now, my situation with veganism is different. I don't think that veganism is the peak of ethical commitment. But I do think that it does make it easier if you do want to be sort of an ethical eater, then cutting off as much stuff as possible makes it easier in terms of achieving your goal, right? Because you don't have to think about anymore about, oh well, where's the meat coming from, or where's the eggs, and where's the cheese coming from? What's all of that stuff is gone. You simplify your life remarkably from that perspective. However, it also costs you, I think, or it costs most people a lot more in terms of effort and in terms of, sort of focus and sticking with it and that sort of stuff, because it's actually, the options in terms of what to actually eat are significantly reduced compared to what most people have. When you go to a dinner party, it's really going to be difficult. When you go to a restaurant, it's going to be difficult, and so on, especially if you don't live in places like New York,
right.
Where, there's a lot of people that actually gather to that. So I don't think they have necessarily the highest moral ground, meaning that you can be, I think, even an ethical omnivore and be consistent in what you do and reduce environmental impact and make sure that that you make the right choices and be perfectly fine. In fact, it's more than fine. You're perfectly defensible from an ethical perspective. But it is also much more complicated. And so if you're an ethical omnivore, you're much more likely to make missteps just simply out of misinformation or lack of proper information or something, because your culinary universe, your dietary universe is much more complicated than that of a vegan.
So the ethical vegan, you think the only real advantage, the only way in which the ethical vegan is more morally advanced than the ethical omnivore is from a sort of prudential perspective. That is, that the ethical vegan is less likely to make mistakes because they've categorically closed off an entire area of, or do you think that there is something morally more admirable in the person who goes as far as the ethical vegan?
Yeah, no, I don't. I think it's the first scenario that you brought up. But then again, that's just my opinion. If you talk to most vegans, they would disagree.
No, I realize that, and I want to be careful to distinguish whether you and I have a disagreement about what you've chosen versus where you and I might have a disagreement about what other people have chosen, towards which you might have a more favorable attitude than I have, right?
Correct. Exactly. That's right. And those are important distinctions. So for instance, I think that most vegans, at least certainly the ones that I know and the ones that I read about, most vegans would say that it is simply ethically unacceptable to eat animals, to kill an animal for food, period.
Right.
In that sense, obviously, if you agree with that position, then veganism is in fact the peak of, from a moral perspective, from an ethical perspective. Since I actually don't happen to think that, I don't think there are very good arguments for that.
Okay.
I think that if an animal, especially because we're talking about animals that actually don't live normally in the wild anyway.
They're domesticated. They're
domesticating animals that wouldn't even exist if it were not for human intervention and management. I think that given that, I really don't see much of an ethical problem in sort of eating meat, as long as I said before, so the animal is well treated, it has a decent life, it's being killed in a certain way, and so on and so forth. But that again is, I think, that's a substantial disagreement with most vegans in terms of that I have with most vegans in terms of what is ethical or not. That said, I do think that from a prudential perspective, vegans have, on the one hand, let's say a clearer moral choice. It's in a sense, it's easier to be ethical if you're a vegan, but on the other hand, they also have a much more complicated life in terms of sort of practical perspective.
Okay, so let's now get to the why, and this strikes me as really important because, one of the things I'm wondering, and that'll come up later, is whether you're in a kind of a position that's very difficult to sustain. In other words, depending on what your reasons are for why you've chose to ethically eat in the way that you have, I might ask whether you really ought to be an ethical vegan, right? In other words, depending on what the reasons are. So maybe you could talk a little bit about what your reasons are for not just ethical eating in general, but the form of ethical eating that you've settled upon.
Well, my reasons are so. I found myself in an interesting situation, especially as a philosopher. So for a long time, a number of years, I read arguments against eating meat by either vegetarians or vegans, including people like Peter Singer, if we want to sort of go for the big names straight away, right? And I always found them intellectually compelling. I said, yeah, sure. If I can avoid to cause suffering and death in order to eat, without starving myself or without making life for myself so difficult that it's really my own quality of life is going to go down significantly, then why? It's hard for me to come up. It was always hard for me to come up with a good argument against it, and yet I kept being a regular
eater, yeah,
omnivore, right?
Yeah.
And so that sort of over the years that created, we're not talking many years, but over the years that created sort of an increasing cognitive dissonance about this sort of stuff. So one day I made an experiment with myself, and I said, okay, I think what's going on here is that intellectually I think I understand the argument, but I cannot relate to it. In an emotional and a deeper perspective, I just can't bring myself to make the decision, take the step. So I got one of these documentaries about treatments of animals, and I forced myself to watch it.
I think you told me this. Yeah, you forced yourself. You subjected yourself to propaganda.
Correct.
Yeah.
And I picked one that I knew. I mean, I read reviews, of course, and I picked one that wasn't really meaning I picked one of the best ones. I picked one of the ones that actually were depicting, because again, as I was saying earlier, maybe we should go back there at some point. You got to be careful because the sources of information, if you just start Googling,
it's a mess.
Or whatever, it's a mess out there. There are very good arguments actually on both sides because it is very complicated. For instance, just let me open a parenthesis. An article that made me pause a few months ago was one by a biologist. And as you know, part of my background is in biology. They say, well, it's all well and good to be vegetarian, but you do realize that means that we're now deforesting a bunch of areas of the planet. We're incidentally killing a lot of wildlife as a result. So are you sure that on balance you're really helping out even from this straight perspective of environmental and animal welfare? It's not quite that clear. You can start making calculations. The calculations are difficult to do in terms of how many wild animals lose their habitat, for instance, as opposed to how many cows, let's say, you kill as an omnivore. So it's really not that easy. But what I did was I did my research. I watched one of the best documentaries, and of course, as I fully expected, it was really horrifying. It's not pretty. It's not a pretty sight. And
you don't want to see how they make sausage, basically. That's
right. Exactly. As they say, you don't want to know how they make it. You really don't. And that actually, sort of did the trick. That's what really sort of that I internalized. I put in balance basically at the same level my emotional response and my intellectual sort of cognitive response. And ever since. This was, 3 or 4 years ago. Ever since, I've been actually sticking with. I've been tweaking around things, as I said, going more or less vegetarian, or more or less sort of pescatarian, or whatever. But I think I reached a good balance that it seems to me at this point is sustainable, in the sense that it doesn't seem to dramatically affect my quality of life. There's plenty of stuff that I can eat that is very nice and so I can cook a lot. I like cooking, and so I can deal with it very easily from a practical perspective. But also, it seems to me that I can manage the sort of the information flow and adjust things without becoming obsessed about it. I mean, one of the things that that you occasionally find, at least this was one of the things you were reacting to during our discussion online, which I've experienced myself, is that sometimes you do find vegetarians and especially vegans who tend to be sort of literally preachy about it and somewhat intolerant about other people's habits. I have not found, I know a lot of vegetarians who are not like that, but I've occasionally encountered that, and that is in fact a turnoff. Like anybody who preaches to you in a moralizing perspective, I think it's not a good thing for in general. So, but I've encountered that only rarely, and so I've been able to deal with my decision without too much cost. I mean, it's probably costing me a little bit more in terms of money and a little bit more in terms of time, but nothing that I cannot handle.
Right. But it sounds to me like, so the reasons you gave sound to me like they're broadly speaking utilitarian. I mean, they're broadly speaking. I'm not saying that you are a utilitarian. I'm saying the reasons you gave.
No, otherwise we're done.
The considerations that you've given are essentially utilitarian ones. In other words, you're not coming at this from the perspective of someone like a Tom Reagan, who comes at the question from a Kantian, a quasi-Kantian perspective, that in a sense you're violating the autonomy and the rights and the dignity of the animal. It's more you're concerned with welfare, matters of welfare, broadly speaking, both suffering and death. Would that be fair to say?
Yeah, I think that's fair to say. With one caveat that I'll get to in a moment. I think it's a good observation, however, perhaps some of those vegans and vegetarians that I mentioned before, maybe they are actually coming at it from a more deontological perspective, whether they realize it or not. They may or may not think in explicit philosophical terms. But yeah, maybe that's what they're. I mean, because if somebody who says, no matter what, killing or suffering or making animals suffer for eating is wrong, period. It's non-negotiable. It seems to me like that is a deontological position. I mean, what do you mean no matter what? Really, you cannot imagine